The leather of the Chesterfield chair felt cold against my bare arms, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the 22nd floor office overlooking a rain-slicked Boston harbor. I watched Meredith. Her manicured fingers, tipped in a shade of red that looked like dried blood, clutched a Montblanc pen. Next to her stood Pierce, his jaw tight, his tailored Brioni suit failing to hide the desperate sweat dampening his collar. Between us sat the prize, a 19th-century French gold chest, its heavy metal surface catching the dull, gray New England light. For years, the internet has been flooded with sensational revenge stories, tales of dramatic late-night confrontations and cinematic ruins. But real retribution? It doesn't happen with gunfire or screaming matches. It happens in silence, measured in the crisp rustle of legal bond paper and the cold ink of federal indictments. "Open it, Pierce," Meredith whispered. Her voice had lost that practiced, soft Southern charm she used to manipulate my father during his final agonizing months with Alzheimer's. Now it was just sharp edge and raw hunger. They were the quintessential greedy heirs, vultures circling a mahogany desk, entirely blind to the trap because they were too busy measuring the room for new drapes. Pierce didn't hesitate. He used a heavy silver letter opener to brutally snap the thick, red wax seal my father had placed on the lock 3 years ago. The metallic click echoed through the room like a gunshot. Pierce yanked the lid back. Nothing. No bearer bonds. No Swiss bank codes. Just a hollow velvet-lined void. An emptiness so profound it seemed to suck the air right out of the room. Meredith's elegant mask shattered. Her face contorted, veins bulging along her neck. "Where is it?" she shrieked, lunging across the table, her fingernails scraping the gold plating. "Where is the 20 million, Vivian? What did you do with his money?" I didn't flinch. I didn't even lean back. I just let a slow, deliberate smile touch my lips, the first true smile I had possessed since they locked me out of my father's funeral. "I didn't do anything, Meredith," I said, my voice steady, dropping like lead weights. Into the silence. "You wanted his legacy. You're looking at it." Before Pierce could speak, Marcus Sterling, my family's lifelong attorney, quietly stood up. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his expression as unreadable as a gravestone. He didn't look at Meredith. He looked toward the heavy oak double doors at the back of the room. The latch clicked. 2 men in dark, unpretentious suits stepped inside. The gold badges clipped to their belts caught the light. Special agents from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Sterling cleared his throat, holding a thick red-stamped folder. "Meredith Pierce, I suggest you sit down," he said, his tone chillingly formal. "Because while this chest is empty, the federal arrest warrant I am about to read is not." To fully comprehend the cold mechanics of the trap currently snapping shut around Meredith and Pierce in this high-rise office, one must look back 3 winters. It began with the slow, terrifying demolition of my father's mind. Richard Vance was a legend in Boston real estate, a man who could calculate the square-foot yield of a commercial tower in his head while walking down Boylston Street. But Alzheimer's doesn't care about intellect. It strips a human being down to the bone piece by agonizing piece. First it was a forgotten lunch meeting, then a misplaced title deed. By the time he wandered out into a blinding New England blizzard clad only in his pajamas, searching for a mother who had been dead for 40 years, the diagnosis was official. It was a terminal sentence scrawled in the sterile ink of a Massachusetts General Hospital neurological report. I stepped away from my own career to become his shield. For 18 months I managed his medications, sat with him through the terrifying sundown hallucinations, and handled the daily operations of Vance Enterprises. It was exhausting, bone-crushing labor, but it was born of love. Then came Meredith. She didn't storm the castle. She glided through the front door under the guise of an old family friend offering respite care. Meredith was a former corporate finance attorney who had traded her courtroom litigation suits for soft, weaponized cashmere and a voice like warm honey. She understood the precise vulnerability of an aging billionaire whose short-term memory was a sieve. Within 3 months, she had moved into the Beacon Hill mansion. Within 6, she had married him in a private, unannounced civil ceremony. Along with her came Pierce, her son from a previous marriage. A Wharton graduate with a face like an ice cube and the predatory instincts of a vulture, Pierce was immediately installed as the executive vice president of my father's firm. They didn't start with overt hostility. Instead, they practiced the art of polite cruelty. They began by whispering in my father's ear during his brief windows of lucidity, subtly twisting his reality. They told him I was stealing from the company, that my exhaustion was actually resentment, and that I was planning to commit him to a state asylum. Because of his paranoia, a common byproduct of the disease, he believed them. Meredith's true masterpiece, however, was legal. One rainy Tuesday morning, I arrived at my father's estate to find 2 private security guards barring the wrought iron gates. They didn't speak. They simply pointed to a man standing on the sidewalk who handed me a thick, legal manila envelope. Inside was an ex parte emergency restraining order, issued by a family court judge who Meredith had known for 2 decades. The attached affidavit was a work of fiction so meticulously crafted it made my blood run cold. It painted me as an abusive, emotionally unstable daughter, who was exploiting her father's cognitive decline for financial gain. Meredith had used her legal connections to procure a rubber-stamped psychological evaluation from a corrupt, compliant physician, stating that my presence accelerated my father's dementia. I fought back. I spent my life savings on a high-stakes litigation attorney, but Meredith and Pierce were playing with my father's infinite checkbook. They buried my lawyer under a mountain of frivolous motions, continuous delays, and expensive depositions. In the courtroom, Meredith was the picture of elegant sorrow, dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief while her legal team portrayed me as a greedy, estranged predator. The judge, swayed by the sheer volume of their high-priced legal artillery, made the restraining order permanent. I was banished from my own father's life under penalty of felony arrest. With the perimeter secured, Pierce and Meredith initiated the final phase of their corporate heist. They brought a mobile notary to the mansion on an evening when my father was heavily sedated on antipsychotics. They placed a pen in his trembling hand and forced him to execute a durable power of attorney. It was a total unrestricted transfer of fiduciary control. What followed was a clinic in white-collar asset stripping, a sequence of events that would have made the most calculated financial villains blush. Pierce utilized his hedge fund background to systematically hollow out Vance Enterprises. He didn't just transfer cash from the corporate accounts. That would leave an immediate, easily traceable paper trail for the state authorities. Instead, he created a labyrinthine network of limited liability companies registered in Delaware entities with sterile, forgettable names like Crimson Leaf Holdings and Essex Trust LLC. Using the durable power of attorney, Pierce took the crown jewels of my father's real estate portfolio, 3 historic commercial buildings in the financial district, and leveraged them to the hilt. He secured $30 million in cross-collateralized commercial loans. But the proceeds of those mortgages never touched my father's medical accounts or the corporate treasury. Through a series of complex, intercompany consulting agreements and intellectual property licensing fees, Pierce funneled the cash directly into the Delaware shell corporations. To the untrained eye, it looked like legitimate business expenses. In reality, it was a systematic, legal vacuuming of my father's life's work. When my father's heart finally gave out on a bitter, sub-zero night in January, I didn't receive a phone call. I learned of his passing 48 hours later, via a cold 3-line paid obituary notice in the Sunday edition of the Boston Globe. The funeral at Mount Auburn Cemetery was a masterclass in social theater. I stood outside the perimeter, shivering in a worn wool coat behind the black cast-iron fence, watching the elite of Boston society offer their condolences to Meredith. She stood beneath a black umbrella, her face obscured by an Italian lace veil, weeping softly into Pierce's arm. 2 off-duty Boston police officers stood at the cemetery gates with a printed photograph of my face, instructed to arrest me on sight if I attempted to say a final goodbye to the man who had raised me. The ultimate act of psychological warfare occurred 24 hours later, when I received a formal citation from Marcus Sterling's office, demanding my presence for the mandatory reading of the will. The Beacon Hill mansion felt like a tomb that had already been looted. The antique silver had been cleared from the sideboards and small white appraisal tags were stuck to the corners of the oil paintings. Meredith sat at the head of the long mahogany conference table, her expression serene, victorious, and completely devoid of grief. Pierce stood behind her, adjusting his gold cufflinks with a slow, rhythmic precision that signaled absolute dominance. Meredith didn't yell. She didn't gloat with loud words. She simply used 2 fingers to push a stamped legal document across the table. It was a codicil to my father's will, drafted and executed just weeks before his death. Your father wanted to ensure you learned the value of self-reliance, Vivian, she said, her voice dropping into that smooth, condescending register. He felt that your behavior over the last 2 years demonstrated a profound lack of respect for the legacy he built. Therefore, he restructured his final wishes. I looked at the page. The text was clear, cold, and devastating. To my daughter Vivian Vance, I leave the sum of $1 and the 19th century French gold chest currently located in my private library. This bequest is conditional upon her immediate vacation of all family properties. The chest is an extraordinary piece of craftsmanship, Vivian. Pierce added, a thin, patronizing smile playing on his lips. It's a shame the lock is rusted shut, and the key was lost back in the 70s. But we felt you should have a keepsake. Something to remind you of what happens when you try to overplay your hand. They expected me to scream. They expected me to throw a tantrum, to threaten lawsuits that they knew I couldn't afford to maintain. They wanted the satisfaction of watching me break. Instead, I reached out and pulled the heavy, dust-covered gold chest toward me. I looked Meredith dead in the eye, then shifted my gaze to Pierce. I let the silence stretch between us until the tension in the room became thick and uncomfortably heavy. Thank you, Meredith, I said softly, my voice devoid of tremor. I will take exactly what my father left me. I picked up the chest, the cold metal biting into my fingers, and walked out into the freezing Boston sleet without looking back. They thought they had left me with a worthless piece of empty metal and a $1 coin. What their massive arrogance prevented them from seeing was that they hadn't given me a consolation prize. They had just handed me the fuse to the dynamite that was about to blow their lives to pieces. The gold chest sat on the laminate kitchen table of my rented 2-bedroom apartment in South Boston. It looked absurd in that space. A multi-$1,000 relic of 19th century French craftsmanship, resting under the buzz of a flickering fluorescent bulb, surrounded by cardboard boxes and the smell of stale coffee. I traced the cold relief carvings of the lid. It weighed exactly 24 pounds. I knew that because 3 years ago, on a crisp November morning in Nantucket, my father had weighed it himself. That was during his last clear week. The doctors called it a transient lucidity, a brief, unexplainable pause where the amyloid plaques in his brain seemed to recede, giving us back the real Richard Vance for 7 glorious days. He didn't waste a single hour of that time weeping. He spent it with me and Marcus Sterling, locked in the study of his summer home, preparing for the war he knew was coming. Vivian, he had said, his voice raspy but entirely steady as he slid the gold chest across his mahogany desk. Meredith thinks she is playing a game of checkers. She's looking at my current checkbook, my active corporate accounts, and the buildings she can see from her bedroom window. She doesn't understand that wealth isn't what you show the world. It's what you hide from it. That week, under Marcus's precise legal direction, we executed the Vance Irrevocable Family Trust No. 4. It was an impenetrable legal fortress. 3 decades of liquidated municipal bonds, private equity shares, and offshore accounts, totaling $28 million, were quietly transferred into the trust. I was named the sole, unalterable beneficiary. The trustee was a private banking firm based in Zurich, completely outside the jurisdiction of the Massachusetts probate courts. Meredith and Pierce didn't have a clue. They were so busy congratulating themselves on seizing control of Vance Enterprises' active, debt-leveraged corporate shell, that they never looked deeper into the old man's personal asset history. But my father knew that simply saving the money wasn't enough. Not for what they were doing to him. He wanted justice. And he knew that the only way to destroy people like Meredith and Pierce was to let their own insatiable nature do the work. Their greed is the noose, my father whispered that night, using a phrase he'd learned from his old shipyard business partners. Just lead them to the execution platform. Their true nature will be revealed. The gold chest was the bait. 2 weeks after the funeral, I initiated the leak. I didn't use a flashy internet post or a public confrontation. I went to Frank Rossi. Frank was a retired commercial title investigator who lived in Quincy, a man who still carried a bitter resentment toward Pierce's hedge fund for a predatory foreclosure that had wiped out his brother's logistics business in 2024. I met Frank at a diner near the Red Line track. The ambient noise of the passing trains muffled our conversation as I slid a weathered, leather-bound accounting ledger across the grease-stained booth. It was an old, unverified asset manifest from my father's private safe, mixed with a few pages of carefully forged financial projections. "Frank," I said, leaning in so close I could smell the chicory in his coffee, "I need this to find its way onto the desk of Pierce's chief financial auditor. It needs to look like an accident. A routine records pull from the historical registry of deeds." Frank didn't ask questions. He opened the ledger, his eyes scanning the entries I had meticulously calculated to appeal directly to a hedge fund mind. The document outlined a fictitious block of federal bearer bonds, issued in 1978, completely untraceable, and accruing non-taxable interest for nearly 50 years inside the French chest. The estimated current value was listed at $21,400,000. To make the bait irresistible, I appended a fraudulent unrecorded pocket deed to a 4-acre parcel of waterfront mud in East Boston, land that the city had recently rezoned for multi-billion-dollar luxury high-rises. But the masterstroke was the lock. I had Frank spread a specific rumor through the Beacon Street gossips. The chest was fitted with a custom dual-cylinder German lock from the post-war era. If anyone attempted to drill the tumblers or force the hinges without the specific double-pronged key which I supposedly possessed, it would trigger a pressurized vial of industrial sulfuric acid hidden within the velvet lining, instantly liquefying the paper bonds and land titles inside. It was a beautiful, ridiculous lie. It sounded exactly like the paranoid eccentricity of an old-money Boston billionaire descending into dementia. To an arrogant Ivy League analyst like Pierce, it was the ultimate puzzle. He wouldn't doubt it for a second because it validated everything he believed about my father's secrecy. The reaction was instantaneous. Within 48 hours, the legal machinery of Tate & Associates, Meredith's high-priced law firm, roared to life. First came the formal demand letters, delivered via certified mail to my apartment. The language was cold, sharp, and dripping with institutional menace. They claimed the gold chest was an uninventoried corporate asset of Vance Enterprises, and demanded its immediate return under threat of a conversion lawsuit. I didn't reply. I let the letters pile up on my counter. Then came the aggressive escalation. Julian filed an emergency motion in Suffolk Probate Court, seeking an injunction to compel production of the asset. They accused me of grand larceny and hiding estate property. I played my part flawlessly. I responded via short, frantic emails directly to Pierce's corporate address, deliberately leaving typos that signaled panic. "Please stop," I wrote. "This is all my father left me. I don't have the key anyway. Just leave me alone." My weakness was their oxygen. The more I retreated, the more certain they became that the $20 million was real, locked inside that gold skin, just waiting for them to snatch it. They could taste the money. Pierce's hedge fund was facing a massive liquidity squeeze due to some bad short positions on tech stocks that quarter. He needed that $20 million to cover his margins before the federal auditors came knocking. 3 days ago, the trap was fully set. Pierce called my cell phone directly, bypassing my legal counsel. His voice was smooth, patronizing, and utterly devoid of empathy. "Vivian, let's be reasonable," he said, the sound of his leather office chair creaking in the background. "You're facing felony contempt charges. You can't afford the defense fees, and honestly, you don't look good in orange. Hand over the chest and the key, and my mother and I will sign a waiver. We'll let you keep your $1 and walk away." I let out a shaky, rehearsed breath into the receiver. If I give it to you, I want it done at Marcus Sterling's office. I want a signed agreement that says I am completely free of this family. I don't want you coming after my savings. I don't want to hear from your lawyers ever again." "Done," Pierce snapped, his triumph so absolute he could barely contain the smirk in his voice. "Tomorrow at 3. Have your lawyer draft the release. We'll sign whatever keeps you from crying in front of the judge." That night, Marcus Sterling and I spent 5 hours drafting the conditional asset transfer and release agreement. It was a masterpiece of legal misdirection, written with the dense, cold precision of a federal statute. We buried the hook in Section 7, subsection C, under a mundane paragraph titled Assumption of Entity Management and Liabilities. The clause stated that by accepting the gold chest and its contents, the executors, Meredith and Pierce, were formally declaring absolute, retroactive beneficial ownership and unalterable fiduciary control over all corporate entities, offshore holding accounts and financial transactions initiated under the durable power of attorney since its execution date. To a casual reader or a greedy attorney rushing to close a deal, it looked like standard boilerplate language designed to ensure that I couldn't claim a share of whatever corporate debt they had piled onto Vance Enterprises. It seemed to protect them. In reality, it was the signature on their own death warrant. By signing that document to get their hands on the empty chest, they were legally stripping away their own ability to claim ignorance. They were stepping into the shoes of the principal actors. They were admitting, in writing under penalty of perjury, that every single dollar moved through those Delaware shell companies was done under their direct, conscious authorization. I printed the document on heavy 90-pound bond paper. The ink was dry, the trap was set, and the tigers were hungry. I packed the empty chest into a canvas duffel bag and walked out into the cold Boston night, ready for the final act. The morning of the scheduled handover, Boston was swallowed by a dense slate-gray fog that rolled off the Atlantic, turning the brick townhouses of Beacon Hill into dark, dripping monuments. Inside my small apartment, the only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator and the clicking of my keyboard. On the screen was the final draft of the Conditional Asset Transfer and Release Agreement. I read Section 7, subsection C, for perhaps the 50th time. Every comma, every semicolon was positioned with lethal intent. In the legal world, a single misplaced punctuation mark can collapse a multi-million-dollar appellate case. I knew this because I had spent the last 3 weeks studying the exact prosecution strategies used by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Massachusetts in white-collar racketeering cases. At precisely 9:15 a.m., my cell phone vibrated against the Formica counter. The caller ID displayed the main corporate line for Vance Enterprises. I didn't answer on the first ring. I let it cycle through 3 times, allowing the digital chime to echo through the empty room, letting Pierce wait. On the 4th ring, I pressed the record button on a small, Olympus digital audio device plugged directly into the phone's audio jack, and then I picked up. Vivian. Pierce's voice cut through the line, sharp and metallic. There was no greeting, no pretense of familial warmth. He was in his element, occupying my father's former corner office, likely looking down at the traffic on State Street. We've reviewed the scheduling for this afternoon. 3 o'clock at Sterling's office still stands. But let's make one thing perfectly clear before you show up with that canvas bag. This isn't a negotiation. It's a surrender. I pulled a breath into my lungs, deliberately shallow, letting a subtle, anxious tremor slip into my voice. I know what it is, Pierce. I've already signed the preliminary release forms Marcus sent over. I just want my father's estate settled. I want my name removed from the public court registry. A low, patronizing chuckle came through the speaker. Good. Because I'm not coming alone, Vivian. Given your history of emotional instability regarding your father's medical care, I'm taking steps to ensure there are no surprises. I've retained Harrison Vance's old colleagues from Bancroft Forensic Accounting. A man named Thomas Vance, no relation to us thankfully, will be present. He specializes in asset verification. If those bearer bonds have been tampered with, or if the serial numbers don't match the historical manifest from 1978, the deal is off, and we file for immediate grand larceny charges. He paused, waiting for me to protest, waiting for the panic to break my voice. I kept my hand flat on the cold kitchen table, my eyes locked on the gold chest sitting across from me. That's fine, I whispered, keeping the cadence hesitant. The chest hasn't been touched since I carried it out of the mansion. But Pierce, what about the lock? I told you I don't have the key. If your people try to force it in Marcus's office, you risk triggering the mechanism. The acid vial? Do you think I'm an idiot, Vivian? Pierce interrupted, his tone dripping with the supreme confidence of a Harvard MBA, who believed the entire world could be quantified on a spreadsheet. I've already anticipated that. I'm bringing Klaus Varner. He's a master locksmith flown in from New York this morning. He specializes in high security, vintage European vaults. He brought a portable digital endoscope and a localized pneumatic stabilization kit. He can neutralize a dual-cylinder German tumbler in 20 minutes without disturbing a single fluid ounce of whatever security measure your father put inside that box. We are going to open it right there on Sterling's conference table, under the lens of a high-definition camera. A camera? I asked, allowing my voice to rise a fraction of an octave, feigning genuine alarm. Every second of the opening will be streamed live via a secure corporate portal to the executive board of Vance Enterprises, Pierce said, his voice swelling with an insufferable, quiet triumph. My mother wants the board to see exactly how we recovered the missing corporate capital you attempted to withhold. It establishes absolute transparency for the upcoming quarterly audit. When that lid pops open and those 20 million in bonds are verified, your little reign of terror over this family ends. Officially. Please, Pierce, I said, letting a soft, broken sigh escape my lips. Don't do the live stream. It's humiliating. It's bad enough that you're stripping me of everything my father built. Don't make an exhibition out of it. You should have thought about that before you spent $50,000 trying to block my mother's power of attorney in probate court, Pierce replied, his voice dropping into a cold, flat register that sounded exactly like a judge pronouncing a sentence. Be there at 3 Vivian. Bring the chest. Bring your dignity if you have any left. Because by 4 o'clock, you'll be nothing more than a footnote in our corporate history. The line went dead with a harsh digital click. I lowered the phone. The nervous tension evaporated from my face instantly, replaced by the rigid, calculating calm that had sustained me through 18 months of exile. I stopped the recording, saved the file into a triple encrypted cloud directory, and emailed a copy to Marcus Sterling with a brief one-sentence note. The target has fully committed to the parameters. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the rain-slicked pavement below. What Pierce called due diligence was actually the final beautiful acceleration of his own destruction. His arrogance was monumental, but it was a very specific kind of upper-class white-collar hubris that I had spent years analyzing. People like Pierce and Meredith don't see individuals, they see systems, and they believe that because they own the system, they own the outcome. They had spent their entire lives operating within the protected enclaves of elite law firms, country clubs, and private equity boards. To them, the law wasn't a moral code. It was a flexible tool used to suppress the weak and protect the wealthy. Because I had chosen not to engage in a vulgar, public screaming match when they barred me from the funeral, because I had retreated quietly to a small apartment in South Boston, they categorized me as defeated. In their minds, submission was synonymous with fear. They couldn't conceive of a scenario where an adversary would deliberately retreat, just to draw them deeper into the swamp. Pierce thought he was being brilliant by bringing a forensic auditor and a master locksmith. He thought he was locking down every escape hatch. What his immense ego prevented him from realizing was that he was doing my logistical work for him. By recording the opening of the chest, by streaming it to the executive board, and by bringing an independent forensic accountant to verify the contents, he was creating an irrefutable, ironclad federal record of the exact moment they took physical possession of the asset. He was eliminating any possible legal defense of plausible deniability. They couldn't claim later that the documents were planted. They couldn't claim they didn't know what they were signing for. I walked back to the table, reached into my coat pocket, and pulled out a small, heavy piece of iron. It was the original key to the gold chest, the one Pierce believed had been lost in the 70s. My father had given it to me during that quiet week in Nantucket, tucked inside an old spectacle case. I didn't need Klaus Varner or a digital endoscope to open the box. The lock was perfectly functional, but I left the key on the counter. Let them use their tools. Let them use their cameras and their expert locksmiths. The more elaborate their preparation, the more spectacular their public execution would be. I pulled the heavy canvas duffel bag toward me, unzipped it, and lowered the 24-pound gold chest inside. The metal groaned slightly against the fabric. I checked my watch. 1:45 p.m. It was time to ride the T into the financial district. The rain was coming down harder now. A cold, relentless autumn deluge that washed the streets clean. I zipped the bag, slung the heavy strap over my shoulder, and stepped out into the fog. The stage was set, the audience was waiting, and the greedy heirs were about to find out exactly what happens when you try to inherit a ghost. The conference room at Sterling and Associates sat on the 14th floor of 60 State Street, overlooking the gray, soup-like fog of Boston Harbor. The room smelled of old paper, expensive leather, and the faint chemical tang of high-definition lens cleaner. In the center of the frosted glass conference table, a commercial-grade digital camera sat atop a heavy carbon fiber tripod. Its blue tally light blinked rhythmically, a silent indicator that the feed was live, streaming directly to the secure corporate portal of the executive board at Vance Enterprises. Meredith sat to the left, her charcoal mink coat draped over the back of her chair. She smelled of Chanel No. 5 and unyielding confidence. Next to her, Pierce leaned back, his legs crossed, tapping a platinum Cartier pen against his knee with a slow, agonizing regularity. Beside them stood their specialists. Thomas Vance, the forensic accountant from Bancroft, had 3 ruggedized Lenovo laptops open, their screens displaying green and white rows of historical asset manifests from 1978. Next to him was Klaus Varner, a thin, gaunt man with grease under his fingernails and a heavy aluminum technician's case resting at his feet. I sat across from them. I didn't take off my trench coat. The damp New England cold was still trapped in the wool, but I welcomed the chill. It kept my pulse steady. I placed the canvas duffel bag on the center of the glass table. The 24-pound weight hit the surface with a dull, heavy thud that made the camera tripod vibrate slightly. "You're late, Vivian," Pierce said. He didn't look up from his pen. His tone was flat, conversational, the voice of a man who had already reviewed the closing documents of a hostile takeover and was simply waiting for the signatures. "The board has been online for 10 minutes. We don't like being kept waiting by someone who no longer holds a single share in this family's future." "The tea was delayed at South Station," I replied. My voice was quiet, small, perfectly matching the submissive, broken persona I had cultivated over the last 3 weeks. I pulled my hands inside the sleeves of my coat, letting my shoulders slump. "The weather is bad." Meredith let out a soft, elegant sigh, her manicured hand rising to adjust the diamond stud in her ear. "Let's skip the melodrama, please. Marcus, produce the documents. We have a dinner reservation at Mistral at 7, and I prefer not to spend my evening in a room that smells like a probate court clerk's office." Marcus Sterling didn't look at her. He sat at the head of the table, his white hair neatly combed, his vintage gold Rolex ticking silently on his wrist. He unclasped a thick, red rope legal folio and slid a 4-page document across the glass. The paper was heavy, 90-pound bond, pristine and intimidating. "This is the conditional asset transfer and release agreement," Marcus said, his voice carrying the dry, unhurried cadence of a man who had spent 40 years watching wealthy people destroy each other in the dark. "Before my client permits Mr. Varner to touch the artifact, both executors must execute the release. It is non-negotiable." Pierce snatched the document, his eyes skimming the text with the rapid, practiced efficiency of a hedge fund manager. He flipped to page 3, his thumb running down the margins, looking for the monetary figures. "Section 4 looks correct," Pierce muttered, looking over at Thomas Vance, the accountant. "The language covers the transfer of the physical container and any unlisted, bearer-form instruments contained within. Standard corporate recovery language." "Check section 7, I whispered, keeping my eyes fixed on the glass table. I just want to make sure you won't sue me for my personal accounts later." "Pierce, you promised. If I give you the chest, you leave me alone." Pierce let out a short, mocking laugh, flipping to section 7. His eyes scanned subsection C. Assumption of entity management and liabilities. To a man who believed he had already won, the clause looked like a standard boilerplate indemnification. It stated that the executors assumed absolute, retroactive beneficial ownership and unalterable fiduciary control over all associated corporate structures, offshore holding accounts and financial vehicles utilized under the Vance family estate since the execution of the durable power of attorney. In Pierce's mind, this simply meant he was taking total control of the assets and blocking me from ever claiming they owed me a dime from those companies. He didn't see the legal tripwire hidden in the word retroactive. He didn't want to see it. The $20 million in bearer bonds was less than 3 feet away from him, trapped inside a canvas bag. "It's standard, Mother," Pierce said, sliding the document to Meredith. "It just confirms that we are the sole operating minds of the estate, and that Vivian has zero standing to challenge any corporate actions we've taken over the last 2 years. It actually protects us from any future nuisance suits from her." Meredith didn't read it. She didn't need to. She trusted Pierce's Wharton degree more than she valued her own legal background. She took her Montblanc pen, her hand steady, and signed her name on the executive execution line. The scratching of the nib against the thick paper was the only sound in the room. Pierce took the pen from her and scrawled his signature beneath hers with a flourish. He slid the document back to Marcus, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp single $1 bill. He flipped it across the table. It landed near my canvas bag. "There's your inheritance, Vivian," Pierce said, his smile thin, sharp, and completely devoid of human warmth. "Take your $1. Go buy yourself a coffee. Now unzip the bag." I didn't touch the dollar bill. I reached out, my fingers steady as I pulled down the heavy zipper of the duffel bag. I peeled back the canvas, revealing the 19th century French gold chest. The dull, yellow metal caught the harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room. Even covered in 40 years of vault dust, it looked magnificent. Pierce's breath hitched slightly. Meredith leaned forward, her eyes widening, her elegant facade cracking for a fraction of a second to reveal the raw, unadulterated hunger beneath. On the laptop screen, I could see the small chat window of the livestream lighting up. The board members of Vance Enterprises were watching every movement. "Mr. Varner," Pierce commanded, his voice tight with anticipation. "Open it." Klaus Varner stepped up to the table. He didn't speak. He opened his aluminum kit, selecting a digital endoscope with a flexible, 4mm fiber optic probe, and a portable pneumatic stabilization rig. He attached the rig to the base of the German-manufactured dual-cylinder lock. The room was silent. For 7 minutes, the only sound was the faint mechanical clicking of Varner's micropicks interacting with the post-war brass tumblers. On his small diagnostic monitor, we could see the internal levers of the lock shifting, pixelated in green. "Almost through the first shear line," Varner murmured, his forehead glistening with a thin layer of sweat. "The internal mechanics are pristine. No signs of corrosion. Whoever built this knew exactly how to protect what was inside." Pierce watched the monitor, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the glass table. "What about the acid vial? Is it stable?" "Stabilization rig is holding the internal chamber flat," Varner said, his hand making a 2mm adjustment with a tension wrench. "If there's liquid inside, it won't spill. One more pin." A sharp, heavy thunk echoed through the room. The sound of cold, high-tensile steel deadbolts disengaging from the internal sleeve of the gold chest. Varner immediately stepped back, packing his tools with the quick, unhurried movements of a professional who wanted no part of what happened next. "It's open," he said flatly. Pierce didn't wait. He pushed Varner out of the way, his hands grabbing the heavy, relief-carved handles of the gold chest. He looked directly into the lens of the tripod camera, ensuring the board of directors had a perfect view of his moment of absolute triumph. "This," Pierce announced to the camera, his voice booming with corporate authority, "is the official recovery of the Vance Enterprises capital reserves." He yanked the lid back. The heavy gold top swung open on its oil-tempered hinges, slamming against the rear stop with a solid metallic ring. The camera pointed directly down into the interior. Nothing. The interior was completely, devastatingly empty. There were no bundles of 1978 federal bearer bonds. There were no unrecorded pocket deeds to East Boston waterfront land. There was only a hollow, faded purple velvet lining, slightly discolored by age, and a small white paper tag glued to the bottom that read, "Fabrique de Coffres-Forts, Paris, 1884. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy and suffocating. Pierce froze, his hand still gripping the edges of the lid, his mouth slightly open. He stared into the gold void as if expecting the $20 million to materialize out of the fabric. Meredith's face turned an ashen, sickly gray. She stood up so quickly her leather chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. "Where is it?" she whispered, her voice cracked, the southern grace entirely gone. She lunged across the table, her manicured fingers diving into the chest, tearing at the purple velvet lining, ripping it away from the wood beneath. "Where is the money? Vivian, what did you do with the bonds?" I didn't answer. I didn't flinch. I sat perfectly still, watching her destroy the lining of a 19th century antique. "You stole it," Pierce roared, turning on me, his face flushing a deep, dangerous crimson. He pointed a trembling finger at my face. "You opened it before you brought it here. You siphoned the bonds. This is fraud." This is grand larceny. Marcus, call the police. I want her arrested right now. Marcus Sterling didn't move toward the phone. Instead, he slowly reached into his suit jacket, pulled out a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses, and put them on. He picked up the copy of the Conditional Asset Transfer and Release Agreement that Meredith and Pierce had signed just 10 minutes prior. I'm afraid that won't be necessary, Pierce, Marcus said, his tone chillingly formal, dropping like a guillotine into the room. The chest has been in a secure, bonded repository since the day Vivian removed it from the mansion. It was never opened. There were never any bearer bonds. Then you lied. Pierce shrieked, his composure completely shattered. He looked at the tripod camera, suddenly realizing that the entire executive board had just watched him open an empty box like a fool. The ledger. The title investigator. It was all a scam. It was a legal diagnostic tool. Marcus corrected him, his voice rising slightly, taking on an authoritative judicial weight. A tool designed to verify whether you and your mother were operating with fraudulent intent regarding the Vance estate. And by signing this agreement today, you have provided the final irrefutable proof. Before Pierce could speak, Marcus pressed a small button beneath the edge of the conference table. The heavy oak double doors at the back of the room clicked open. Two men in dark, unpretentious charcoal suits stepped into the room. They didn't look like corporate lawyers. They had the thick necks and steady, unblinking eyes of federal law enforcement. Clipped to the waistbands of their trousers were gold, circular shields. Special agents from the Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division. Behind them stood an assistant U.S. attorney from the District of Massachusetts. Miss Eleanor Vance, Mr. Julian Vance, the lead agent said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion as he pulled a set of tri-folded documents from his breast pocket. I am Special Agent Miller. This is a federal warrant for your immediate arrest, issued by the United States District Court in Boston. Meredith stumbled back against the glass wall, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. On what grounds? We haven't done anything. We just signed a corporate release. That's exactly the problem, Meredith, I said, my voice no longer small, no longer submissive. I stood up, straightening my shoulders, looking down at her from across the table. The illusion was over. For 18 months, the IRS and the SEC have been tracking the $30 million you siphoned out of my father's real estate portfolio through Crimson Leaf Holdings and Essex Trust LLC. But you were smart. You used proxy managers, nominee accounts, and shell structures to keep your names off the active signature cards. The feds knew the money was stolen, but they couldn't prove you were the direct, willful operating minds behind the fraud. Pierce looked down at the signed agreement on the table, his eyes widening in sudden, horrific comprehension as his mind finally parsed Section 7, subsection C. By signing that document to claim this empty chest, I continued, my voice cold and sharp as a scalpel, you formally declared under penalty of perjury that you held absolute, retroactive beneficial ownership and fiduciary control over those exact Delaware entities since day one. You legally waived your defenses. You took his money. And you signed your own confession to get it. The second agent stepped forward, the metallic clink of steel handcuffs echoing through the room. You are being charged with federal wire fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy, and financial elder abuse. You have the right to remain silent. Julian began to scream, a high-pitched, desperate sound as the agents grabbed his arms, forcing his hands behind his back. The Cartier pen dropped from his fingers, rolling across the glass table until it clicked against the empty gold chest. Meredith didn't scream. She simply collapsed into her mink coat, her eyes vacant, her elegant life turning into a hollow velvet-lined void before the live lens of the corporate camera. The echo of steel handcuffs snapping shut eventually fades, but the silence it leaves behind in a high-rise office is a heavy, physical thing. The thick oak double doors swung shut, cutting off Pierce's frantic, escalating threats to sue the entire United States government. The room still smelled of Meredith's Chanel No. 5, but the expensive fragrance was rapidly losing ground to the sharp, damp, ozonic scent of the autumn rain blowing through the cracked window pane. Marcus Sterling walked over to the mahogany sideboard, his knee joints popping slightly in the quiet room. He poured 2 fingers of neat Macallan into a heavy crystal tumbler and slid it across the glass table. It stopped precisely 2 inches away from the single-dollar bill Pierce had thrown at me like an insult. I didn't touch the glass. Instead, I reached out and picked up the bill. It was creased crisp, a standard piece of Federal Reserve ink. I folded it deliberately once, twice, before slipping it into the deep pocket of my damp trench coat. For 18 months, my fingers had been numb with exhaustion and grief. Now they were finally warm. The U.S. Attorney's Office expects a grand jury indictment by Tuesday morning, Marcus said, his voice dropping into that low, gravelly register he used when a corporate battle was over. He looked older, the deep lines around his eyes softening as the tension of the last 3 years began to drain from his posture. They're freezing every commercial account attached to Crimson Leaf Holdings and Essex Trust by 5 o'clock today. The court-appointed receiver will assume full operational control of Vance Enterprises before the markets open tomorrow. And the Beacon Hill estate? I asked. My voice was flat, level, completely stripped of the hesitant, anxious tremor I had used to lure Pierce into the office. The locks are being drilled and changed as we speak, Vivian, Marcus replied, taking a slow, measured sip of his scotch. The private security detail you retained took their positions at the wrought iron gates 20 minutes ago. Meredith's personal property will be inventoried, packed into standard commercial storage crates, and shipped to her sister's address in Greenwich, Connecticut. You can sleep in your own bed tonight. The nightmare is over. Home. The word felt completely foreign, almost dangerous after so long. For 18 months, home had been a sterile hospital room, followed by a bitter courtroom, followed by a cramped, drafty apartment in South Boston where I had to listen to the rumble of the Red Line trains while mapping out federal tax statutes. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling glass wall, pressing my forehead against the cool pane. Below us, the dense Atlantic fog was finally breaking, revealing the sharp, slate-gray grid of the financial district. Down on State Street, the blue flashing lights of the unmarked federal cruisers were being swallowed up by the mundane evening commuter traffic. Nobody on the sidewalk knew what had just happened on the 22nd floor. They didn't see the empire collapse. They didn't know that 2 predators had just stepped into their own cage. Behind me, the 19th century French gold chest sat open, its torn purple velvet lining exposed to the harsh fluorescent lights. Stripped of its mysterious allure, it looked smaller. It looked like what it always was. An expensive piece of hollow metal. People like Meredith and Pierce spend their entire lives building elaborate fortresses out of paper assets, shell corporations, and weaponized family court orders. They look at a human being and see nothing but a schedule of assets to be exploited. They thought they were the alpha predators of Boston real estate, because they had the cold nerve to rob a dying man using a corrupt notary and a smile. But they made the classic mistake of every arrogant white-collar criminal. They assumed that because I chose not to engage in a vulgar, screaming match on the steps of the courthouse, I was defeated. They truly believed that submission was synonymous with fear. They forgot that the most dangerous adversary isn't the one making noise in the press. It's the one quietly sitting in the back of the room, collecting the receipts. Every dollar Pierce funneled through those Delaware accounts has been accounted for, down to the last copper cent. We didn't waste time fighting them in probate court, because probate is a slow bureaucratic swamp where high-priced defense lawyers can drag a case out until the clock runs out. We gave them exactly what their nature demanded. We let their insatiable greed serve as our logistical engine. My father's true legacy wasn't the real estate empire. It was the strategy he gave me in Nantucket. He taught me that justice is a cold, calculated mathematical equation. Greed is an empty gold chest, magnificent on the outside, but an infinite void within. Pierce and Meredith wanted the gold, and I gave it to them. It is a profound irony that the only thing filling that box now is a federal indictment. I swung the heavy lid shut and walked out into the rain toward Mount Auburn Cemetery. I had finally given my father his final piece, restoring the family name to its proper place. If this story reminded you that karma always collects its debts, please leave a comment, like, and subscribe to our unique channel. Your support keeps these truths alive.